Sarah had survived 17 years of her father's explosive rage, the shattered plates, the holes punched in walls, the thunderous shouting that made her bones rattle. She knew how to read that storm, when to hide, when to stay silent. But Marcus was different. Marcus never raised his voice. He never had to. His silence was a scalpel where others used sledgehammers, and in the 6 months since their wedding, Sarah had learned that quiet control could be far more suffocating than any scream. Tonight, as she stood in their immaculate kitchen at 11 p.m., staring at the dinner she'd reheated 3 times, watching him calmly set down his briefcase and remove his coat with that same measured precision, she felt her chest constrict with a fear she couldn't name. Because the most terrifying thing about Marcus wasn't what he did, it was what he didn't do. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. And that was when Sarah finally understood. She had married a man more dangerous than her father ever was, precisely because no one would ever believe her. The architecture of silence. Sarah met Marcus Holloway at the hospital where she worked as a pediatric nurse. He was everything her chaotic childhood hadn't prepared her for: stable, successful, composed. At 34, he was a senior architect at one of the city's most prestigious firms, the kind of man who wore tailored suits even on casual Fridays, and whose apartment looked like a page torn from a design magazine. Their first date had been at an art gallery opening. While Sarah felt out of place in her department store dress, Marcus moved through the crowd with effortless confidence, introducing her to colleagues and clients as though she already belonged to his world. "You're different from anyone I've ever met," he told her that night, his hand settling on the small of her back with proprietary gentleness. "You're authentic, real. Everyone else is performing all the time." The compliment had made her glow. After a lifetime of feeling like damaged goods, the girl from the broken home, the scholarship kid who never quite fit in, Marcus made her feel chosen, special. Within 3 months, he'd proposed with a ring that cost more than her car. Within 6 months, they were married in a ceremony his mother planned down to the last orchid. The first crack appeared on their honeymoon in Santorini. Sarah had wanted to explore the local markets, maybe get lost in the winding streets like the travel blog suggested. Marcus had other plans. He'd researched the island meticulously, created an itinerary that maximized their time, booked reservations at restaurants that required connections to access. "I just thought we could be spontaneous," Sarah had suggested, scrolling through photos of a small family taverna she'd found online. Marcus had smiled, that patient smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Sweetheart, spontaneity is just poor planning dressed up as adventure. I've spent weeks making sure we have the perfect experience. You trust me, don't you?" The question had felt like a trap, though she couldn't explain why. Of course she trusted him. He was her husband. He'd rescued her from a studio apartment with questionable plumbing and a job that barely paid her student loans. So she'd deleted the taverna from her saved locations and followed his itinerary, ignoring the small, uncomfortable feeling that she was a chess piece being moved across a board she couldn't see. Back home, the pattern crystallized. Marcus never shouted when she was late from work, never slammed doors when dinner wasn't ready. Instead, he'd greet her with a kiss and a quiet observation: "I noticed you've been struggling with time management lately. Maybe we should look at your schedule together." He'd pull out his tablet, already populated with a color-coded calendar he'd created for her, complete with reminders for errands, gym time, and meal prep. "I don't need to be managed," Sarah had protested once, trying to keep her tone light. "Of course not," Marcus had agreed, his hand covering hers with gentle pressure. "I'm helping you be your best self. That's what partners do. Unless you think you're doing fine on your own?" The words were kind. The tone was reasonable. But underneath ran a current that made Sarah's throat tight, because embedded in that question was an accusation. Without him, she was failing. Without his structure, his planning, his guidance, she was the chaos she'd spent her whole life trying to escape. Her friend Jennifer noticed it first. They'd been colleagues since Sarah started at the hospital, and Jennifer had been her maid of honor despite having met Marcus only a handful of times before the wedding. "You seem different," Jennifer said one afternoon during their lunch break. They were sitting in the hospital cafeteria, and Sarah had just declined an invitation to Jennifer's birthday dinner because Marcus had planned a couple's cooking class that same night. "Different how?" Sarah asked, stabbing at her salad. Marcus had suggested she focus on eating cleaner, Not because she needed to lose weight, he'd been careful to clarify, but because he wanted her to feel energized and healthy. Smaller, Jennifer said bluntly, like you're constantly second-guessing yourself. The Sarah I knew had opinions. She made jokes. She didn't ask permission to order dessert. I don't ask permission, Sarah shot back, heat rising to her cheeks. No? Jennifer raised an eyebrow. Because Viv. Minutes ago, you texted Marcus to ask if it was okay to get the chocolate cake. And when he texted back about your wellness goals, you ordered fruit. Sarah opened her mouth to defend herself, then closed it. The truth was complicated. Marcus never forbade her anything. He never issued ultimatums or made demands. He simply expressed concern, offered alternatives, reminded her of the goals they'd set together. He did it with such care, such apparent investment in her well-being, that refusing felt churlish, ungrateful, like she was rejecting not just his suggestion but his love itself. He cares about me, Sarah said finally. Is that so terrible? Jennifer's expression softened. No, honey, caring isn't terrible, but there's a difference between caring and controlling, and I'm worried you can't tell the difference anymore. That night, Sarah lay awake beside Marcus, listening to his measured breathing. He slept the way he did everything else, with discipline and control. He never snored, never tossed or turned, never disturbed the pristine arrangement of their white duvet cover. The bedroom was kept at exactly 68 degrees. The blackout curtains blocked every photon of light. It was perfect for sleep, Marcus had explained when she'd mentioned missing the streetlight that used to shine through her old apartment window. This was better. This was optimal. Jennifer's words circled in her head like vultures. Smaller, second-guessing, permission. Was she being controlled? The question felt absurd. Marcus had never hurt her, never threatened her, never done any of the things her father had done. He was attentive and successful and wanted the best for her. He'd upgraded every aspect of her life, her wardrobe, her car, the size of her student loan payments, which he'd insisted on helping with despite her protests. He'd given her stability, security, a future that didn't involve pinching pennies and eating ramen. But as she stared at the ceiling in the temperature-controlled darkness, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was slowly disappearing, that every small concession, the schedule, the diet, the social calendar, the way she'd started clearing her opinions with him before voicing them to others, was eroding something essential. She was becoming a hologram of herself, projected at the exact specifications Marcus had designed. The truly terrifying part was how reasonable it all seemed. How could she complain about a man who never yelled, never demeaned, never raised a hand? Who could she tell? What would she even say? My husband is too calm. He cares too much. He's too invested in my success and happiness. She thought of her mother, who'd stayed with her father for 23 years, who'd worn sunglasses to hide black eyes and long sleeves to cover bruises. At least that abuse had been visible. At least it had a name. This thing with Marcus existed in shadows and silences, in the gap between his words and their impact, in the slow-motion sough. Occasion of being loved to death by a man who never raised his voice. Sarah turned onto her side, careful not to disturb Marcus. Tomorrow, she decided, she would make one small choice that was entirely her own. Something he hadn't scheduled or suggested or optimized. She didn't know what yet. But she needed to prove to herself that she still could, that she still existed underneath all his careful construction of who she should be. The breaking point. The small rebellion Sarah chose was pathetically modest. She bought a plant. Not just any plant, but a wild, unruly pothos from the hospital gift shop. The kind that would sprawl and vine in unpredictable directions, that would require intuition rather than precision to care for. She brought it home and set it on the kitchen windowsill, where it immediately disrupted the carefully curated aesthetic Marcus had designed. All clean lines, marble counters, and a color palette of whites and grays. Marcus noticed it immediately when he came home. Of course he did. Marcus noticed everything. That's new, he said, setting down his briefcase with that same measured calm. He didn't approach the plant, didn't touch it, just observed it from across the kitchen island like an architect assessing a structural flaw. I thought it would be nice to have something living in here, Sarah said, trying to keep her voice light even as her heart hammered. She felt ridiculous, a grown woman nervous about a $7 plant. Mmm. Marcus poured himself water from the filtered pitcher, took a precise sip. I thought we'd agreed to maintain the minimalist aesthetic. Plants are unpredictable. They drop leaves, attract insects, require maintenance that might not fit the space. It's one plant, Marcus. Of course. He smiled, that patient smile. I'm not saying remove it. I'm just making an observation. Though if you wanted greenery, we could have consulted with the interior designer about options that would complement the space. There are beautiful preserved arrangements that give the effect without the chaos. Dead plants, Sarah thought. He wanted dead plants that would never grow or change or surprise anyone. I like this one, she said, and the words felt like setting down a flag on hostile territory. Something flickered in Marcus's eyes, too quick to name. Then it was gone, replaced by that same benevolent understanding. Then we'll keep it, he said. I just want you to be happy, Sarah. You know that. The plant became Sarah's small act of resistance. She watered it without checking the moisture meter Marcus suggested she purchase. She let its vines trail where they wanted, even when they grew asymmetrically. When Marcus casually mentioned an article about optimal plant placement and light exposure, Sarah smiled and nodded and left the pothos exactly where it was. It was such a tiny thing, but it was hers. Jennifer noticed the shift when they met for coffee on one of Sarah's rare unsupervised afternoons. Marcus had a work conference, and for the first time in months, Sarah's Saturday was her own. You seem different, Jennifer said, echoing her earlier observation but with a different inflection. More present. I bought a plant, Sarah said, and then laughed at how absurd it sounded. God, listen to me. My big victory is a $7 pothos. But Jennifer didn't laugh. She reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand. Small steps matter, especially when someone's been making you believe you're not capable of taking any steps at all. It's not that bad. Sarah started automatically, then stopped. Was that true? Or had she just gotten so good at minimizing, so practiced at defending Marcus's behavior, that she couldn't see it clearly anymore? Tell me something, Jennifer said carefully. When was the last time you did something Marcus didn't approve of? Not just the plant. I mean, really did something, went somewhere, saw someone, made a choice, without his input or permission or gentle guidance. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. She scrolled back through the past 6 months, looking for moments of autonomy. They were sparse, scattered, and almost always followed by Marcus's quiet disappointment. The time she'd stayed late at work for a colleague's goodbye party, without asking first, and Marcus had greeted her with concern about her safety walking to her car alone at night, about how worried he'd been, about how a simple text would have eased his mind. The time she'd bought a dress without consulting him, and he'd complimented it while mentioning that the color washed her out a bit, that he'd be happy to help her develop a better sense of what suited her complexion. The time she'd suggested they skip his mother's Sunday dinner to have a quiet evening alone, and he'd agreed while noting how hurt his mother would be, how family was important, how he'd hate for Sarah to damage that relationship over something as trivial as wanting to stay in. He never said no. He never had to. He just made every unauthorized choice feel like a mistake she'd regret making. I can't remember, Sarah admitted quietly. That night, Sarah came home to find Marcus in the kitchen, the pothos sitting on the counter beside him. Her heart dropped. We need to talk about this, Marcus said, his voice as level as ever. I've been patient, but I think we need to address what's really happening here. What's really happening is I bought a plant, Sarah said, but her voice wavered. No. Marcus set down the dish towel he'd been holding with deliberate precision. What's really happening is you're pulling away. You're making unilateral decisions without considering how they affect our shared space, our shared life. And I'm concerned, Sarah. This isn't like you. Maybe it is like me. Sarah shot back, surprised by the heat in her own voice. Maybe you just don't know me as well as you think you do. The silence that followed was crushing. Ma. Artius didn't move, didn't react. He just looked at her with an expression of such profound disappointment that Sarah felt herself shrinking despite her resolve. I've given you everything, he said finally, quietly. I've built a life for us. I've invested in your happiness, your growth, your potential, and this is how you repay that? With hostility? With accusations? I'm not accusing you of anything, aren't you? He stepped closer, his voice never rising above that terrible calm. You think I don't see it? The way you've been pulling back, questioning everything, talking to Jennifer about our marriage like I'm some kind of villain. I provide for you, Sarah. I care for you. I've never raised my voice, never raised a hand, and somehow I'm still not enough." The words hit like physical blows precisely because they were partially true. He had given her things. He had never been physically violent. By every conventional measure, he was a good husband. So why did she feel like she was suffocating? "I just need some space to be myself," Sarah whispered. "You are yourself. The best version of yourself. The version that's not controlled by impulse and chaos and poor decision-making. I've helped you become that person." Marcus's hand came up to cup her cheek, a gesture that might have looked tender to anyone watching. "Don't throw that away because you're having some kind of crisis. We're a team, Sarah. We make decisions together. That's what marriage is." Sarah stood froze. In her immaculate kitchen, her husband's hand on her face, and felt the architecture of her life closing in like a tomb. He was right. He had to be right. The alternative, that she'd married a man who was systematically erasing her under the guise of improvement, was too terrifying to accept. That night, she moved the plant to the bathroom, where Marcus wouldn't have to see it. It was a compromise, she told herself. Healthy relationships required compromise. But alone in the bathroom at 2 a.m., unable to sleep, Sarah stared at the pothos and saw her own reflection in its leaves, alive but confined, growing but only in the direction someone else had deemed acceptable. And for the first time since meeting Marcus, Sarah allowed herself to think the unthinkable. What if the most dangerous abuse was the kind that came wrapped in care? What if the worst prisons were the ones built with concern and optimization and love? What if she was trapped, and the only person who couldn't see the bars was her? The realization should have felt liberating. Instead, it felt like drowning. The plant died 3 weeks later. Sarah found it on a Tuesday morning, its leaves yellowed and drooping, the soil bone dry despite her careful watering. She stood in the bathroom doorway staring at the withered vines and understood with perfect clarity what had happened. Marcus had killed it, not dramatically, not obviously, just by denying it what it needed to survive. A little less water each day. A slight adjustment of the blinds to block the light. Small, plausible actions that could never be proven as sabotage. Just like what he was doing to her. Sarah called in sick to work that day. While Marcus was at the office, she sat on the floor of their pristine living room and made a list of everything she'd lost since the wedding. Her spontaneity, her opinions, her friendships, because Marcus always had reasonable concerns about her friends, their influence, the time they took from their marriage, her career ambitions, because Marcus worried about her stress levels, encouraged her to consider part-time work, reminded her they didn't need her income, her body autonomy, because Marcus had suggestions about her health, her appearance, her wellness that felt like guidance but functioned like commands. The list filled 3 pages. When Marcus came home that evening, Sarah was still sitting on the floor, surrounded by her handwritten inventory of loss. He stopped in the doorway, his briefcase in hand, and for the first time in their relationship, he looked uncertain. "Sarah, what's wrong?" She looked up at him, this handsome, successful, controlled man who had never raised his voice, and felt something inside her crystallize into steel. "I want a divorce." The words hung in the air like a grenade. Marcus's face went through a rapid calculation of responses before settling on concerned confusion. "You're upset about the plant," he said, setting down his briefcase. "I know, yo. You're upset, and I should have been more supportive." "You killed it," Sarah said flatly. "And before that you killed everything I was before I met you. You just did it so quietly that I thought I was doing it to myself. That's not fair." Marcus's voice remained calm, but there was an edge now, a razor hidden in velvet. "I've done nothing but love you." "No." Sarah stood up, her legs shaking but her voice steady. "You've done nothing but control me. And the most fucked up part is you made me complicit in my own erasure. You made me believe I was choosing to disappear." "You're being hysterical. I'm being clear for the first time in months." Sarah walked to the bedroom, Marcus following. She pulled her old suitcase from the closet, the one she'd used before Marcus had upgraded her luggage to matching designer pieces. "I'm leaving, tonight. And I'm not discussing it, not negotiating it, Not letting you talk me into staying while you work on things according to some plan you've already optimized. Marcus's calm finally cracked. Not into shouting, he was too controlled for that, but into something colder. His eyes went flat, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more frightening than any scream. "You won't make it without me," he said. "You'll go back to your shitty apartment and your overwhelming debt and your chaotic little life, and you'll realize what you gave up. I made you better, Sarah. I made you worth something." Sarah stopped packing and looked at him, really looked at him, and saw clearly for the first time what she'd married, not a partner, not even really a person, but a system. A machine designed to process messy, complicated humans into optimized versions that served his vision of perfection. She'd mistaken his control for love because it had been so much quieter than her father's rage. But silence could be just as violent. Calm could be just as cruel. "You know what the saddest part is?" Sarah said, zipping her suitcase. "I almost believed you. I almost believed that I needed to be fixed, that my mess was a problem, that being controlled was the same as being loved. But you know what I learned from that plant?" Marcus didn't answer, just stared at her with those flat, calculating eyes. "Some things are meant to grow wild, and if you love them, you give them space to do that. You don't prune and train and optimize them into something that fits your aesthetic. You don't kill them slowly while pretending it's for their own good." She walked past him toward the door. He didn't try to stop her physically. That would have been too obvious, too provable. Instead, he used his final weapon, words. "Everyone will think you're crazy," called after her. "I never hit you. I never yelled. What are you going to tell people? That I cared too much? That I was too good to you? They'll think you're ungrateful, unstable. They'll think you're just like your father, broken and volatile and incapable of appreciating love. Well, Hen, it's right in front of you." Sarah stopped at the door, her hand on the knob. For a moment, she felt the familiar pull of doubt, the voice that said he was right, that she was overreacting, that she was throwing away something precious over her own inability to accept being loved. Then she thought of the plant, of its wild, chaotic vines, of how it had reached for light and life until someone had systematically denied it both. "You're probably right," she said without turning around. "Maybe people won't understand. Maybe they'll think I'm crazy for leaving someone who never raised his voice. But I'd rather be crazy and free than sane and suffocating." She opened the door and walked out into the night, leaving behind the pristine apartment and the color-coded calendar and the man who had loved her the way a curator loves an exhibit, with precision and possession and no understanding that alive things need to breathe. Sarah slept on Jennifer's couch that night and cried harder than she'd cried since childhood. Not because she regretted leaving, but because she was grieving, mourning the person she'd been before Marcus, mourning the months she'd lost, mourning the insidious way she'd been made to participate in her own diminishment. "You did the right thing," Jennifer whispered, holding her while she sobbed. "Then why does it feel so terrible?" "Because abuse doesn't stop being abuse just because it's quiet. Because trauma doesn't require bruises. Because you've been gaslit into thinking your own survival instinct was a character flaw." Jennifer pulled back to look at her. He was right about one thing. A lot of people won't understand. They'll think you're ungrateful. They'll say he was a good man. But Sarah? The people who matter will get it. And more importantly, you'll get it. You'll remember how to be messy and imperfect and gloriously, chaotically yourself. It took Sarah 8 months to fully extricate herself from Marcus. 8 months of lawyers and negotiations, and Marcus's continued attempts to discuss things rationally in ways that always left her feeling crazy and small. 8 months of him telling their mutual acquaintances that he was concerned about her mental health, of him sending long, reasonable emails about his willingness to work on the relationship, of him maintaining his facade of the perfect wronged husband while quietly sabotaging her attempts to move forward. But eventually, it was done. The divorce was finalized. Sarah moved into a small apartment with mismatched furniture and terrible water pressure and a kitchen window that faced a brick wall. It was imperfect and chaotic, and it was entirely beautifully hers. She bought 3 more plants, all of them wild and unruly and impossible to optimize. She let them grow however they wanted. She watered them when it felt right, not according to any schedule. When people asked her why she left Marcus, she told the truth simply. He never raised his voice. And that terrified me. Most people didn't understand. Some thought she was dramatic. Others suggested she'd had unrealistic expectations. But a few, a precious, important few, got it immediately. They were usually women who'd felt that same subtle suffocation, that slow erasure disguised as devotion. One evening, almost a year after leaving, Sarah was repotting one of her plants when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Sarah, this is Amy. We met at the hospital fundraiser a few years ago. I'm friends with Marcus's new girlfriend, and I needed to talk to someone who knew him." Sarah's blood went cold. "Is she okay?" "I think so, for now. But I'm watching him do the same things you probably saw. The calm control, the helpful suggestions, the way he's slowly reshaping her into someone else. And she keeps telling me how lucky she is, how stable he is, how he's helping her be her best self. And Amy's voice cracked. "I remembered you left him, and I thought maybe you could tell me if I'm crazy to be worried." Sarah closed her eyes, grief and anger warring in her chest. Part of her wanted to stay out of it, to let Marcus be someone else's problem. But she thought of herself a year ago, sitting on that pristine living room floor, finally understanding that she was trapped. "You're not crazy," Sarah said firmly. "You're seeing clearly. And your friend, she's going to need someone who believes her what? And she's ready to see it too. Someone who understands that the most dangerous abuse is the kind that looks like love." They talked for an hour. Sarah shared her story, answered questions, explained the patterns she'd learned to recognize. At the end of the call, Amy was crying. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for being willing to talk about it, even though people probably think you're crazy." Sarah finished. "Ungrateful. Damaged. I know. But here's what I've learned. I'd rather be all those things and free than perfect and trapped. And your friend deserves the chance to make that choice too, when she's ready." After hanging up, Sarah sat with her plants in the fading evening light and felt something shift in her chest. The weight she'd been carrying, the shame, the doubt, the voice that still sometimes whispered that she'd overreacted, lightened just a little. Because Marcus was right about one thing, she was broken. But not in the way he meant. She was broken open, cracked apart in the places where his control had tried to seal her shut. And through those cracks, wild things were growing. 2 years after leaving Marcus, Sarah stood in her new apartment, bigger than the first one, with windows that let in real light, and barely recognized the person she'd been. She'd gone back to school, was working toward becoming a nurse practitioner. She'd reconnected with old friends Marcus had slowly edged out of her life. She'd even started dating again, though she was careful now, watchful for red flags she'd once mistaken for green ones. She kept the plants, all of them, wild and imperfect and impossible to optimize. And sometimes when she watered them in the morning light, she thought about that first pothos, the one that had died so Marcus could maintain his perfect aesthetic. That plant had saved her life, not by surviving, but by showing her what happened to living things under Marcus's care. They withered in silence, and no one heard them scream. But Sarah had found her voice again. It wasn't always steady, it wasn't always loud, but it was hers, and that was enough. She'd learned the hardest truth, that abuse doesn't announce itself with raised voices and slammed doors. Sometimes it comes in whispers and suggestions, in optimization and improvement, in the steady erosion of self disguised as devotion. Sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't the storm, it's the quiet before it. The calm that slowly steals your air until you forget what breathing freely feels like. Marcus never raised his voice, and in the end, that had been the warning sign she'd needed to hear all along. Because love doesn't ask you to disappear. It doesn't require your silence. Real love makes space for your mess, your chaos, your wild and tangled growth. Real love doesn't need to be quiet to be safe. Real love isn't afraid of the sound of your voice.